February 1945, Iwo Jima. A Marine Corps lieutenant watches through binoculars as a strange-looking Sherman tank approaches a Japanese bunker. The tank looks normal until its turret rotates and something impossible happens. A stream of liquid fire 150 feet long pours into the fortification. The temperature inside reaches 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit in seconds. The screaming starts immediately. Within minutes, the bunker that had held up an entire Marine battalion for 3 days surrenders, something that had never happened before in the Pacific War. The Japanese had a name for this machine. They called it the beast that makes demons flee. American Marines called it something simpler, the Zippo. Its official designation was M4A3R3 flame tank, and it was the most psychologically devastating weapon of the Pacific theater, more feared than bombs, artillery, or even the atomic weapons that would end the war. This is why Japanese soldiers, who would fight to the death against anything else, broke and ran when they saw it coming.
The problem of the Pacific. To understand why the flame tank became necessary, you need to understand the unique horror of Pacific Island warfare. By 1944, the American island hopping campaign had developed a brutal pattern. Marines would land on an island. Japanese forces would retreat into elaborate defensive positions, bunkers, caves, tunnel systems, and fight to the absolute death. Not fight hard, fight to the death. Japanese military doctrine explicitly forbade surrender. The warrior code of Bushido made capture worse than death. Soldiers were told their families would be disgraced if they surrendered. Officers were expected to commit suicide rather than be captured. This created an impossible tactical problem for the Americans. Traditional infantry tactics didn't work. You couldn't outflank a bunker carved into solid rock. You couldn't wait them out. Japanese soldiers would stay underground for weeks with minimal supplies. Artillery and naval bombardment barely dented these positions. At Tarawa in 1943, the U.S. Navy fired 3,000 tons of shells at the island before the landing. The Japanese, dug into coconut log bunkers and coral caves, lost less than 10% of their force. The Marines suffered 3,000 casualties, taking an island 2 miles long. At Peleliu in 1944, intelligence predicted the island would fall in 4 days. It took 73 days and cost 10,000 American casualties. The Japanese had turned the island's coral caves into an interconnected fortress. Every cave had to be cleared individually. The standard clearing technique was nightmarish. Infantry would approach the bunker under covering fire. Engineers would try to get close enough to place explosive charges. Flamethrower teams, men carrying 70 pounds of jellied gasoline on their backs, would spray fire into the opening. The flamethrower operators' casualty rate was catastrophic. They were priority targets. The tanks on their backs were vulnerable. Average life expectancy after entering combat, 4 minutes. The Marine Corps needed a better solution. They needed something that could deliver flame weapons without exposing infantry, something that could survive Japanese anti-tank weapons, something mobile enough to navigate volcanic rock and jungle terrain. They needed the flame tank.
The machine. Engineering hell. The M4A3R3 Zippo wasn't a new tank. It was a nightmare retrofitted onto America's most common armored vehicle. Start with the M4A3 Sherman, medium tank, 30 tons, 75mm main gun. Reliable, mass-produced, good enough. The workhorse of the American Armored Forces. Now remove the main gun. That's right, the primary weapon comes out. In its place, install a Navy Mark I flame gun. This wasn't a flamethrower. This was a weapon designed to project flaming liquid 150 feet with enough pressure to penetrate bunker openings and flow around corners. The fuel system was the key innovation. Inside the tank, 2 large tanks held 290 gallons of fuel mixture, a combination of diesel, gasoline, and napalm thickening agent. Napalm was relatively new technology, developed in 1942. It made the fuel sticky. When it hit something, it clung, and it kept burning. A compressed nitrogen system provided pressure. When the gunner pulled the trigger, pressurized fuel shot through the gun barrel at high velocity. At the muzzle, an ignition system, basically a giant spark plug, ignited the stream. The result was a jet of liquid fire with a range of 150 feet. In practice, operators could hit targets at 200 feet. The fuel stuck to everything it touched: concrete, metal, uniforms, skin. And it burned at approximately 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But here's the weapon's real genius. It wasn't just about the fire.
When that stream of burning fuel entered an enclosed space, a bunker, a cave, a pillbox, it created an instant inferno. But it also consumed all the available oxygen. Soldiers who weren't directly hit by flame would asphyxiate in seconds. The temperature would spike so high that ammunition would cook off. Metal surfaces would become hot enough to cause burns from proximity alone. And the psychological effect was immediate and total. The M4A3R3 carried enough fuel for approximately 61-second bursts. In practice, operators would fire 2 to 5-second streams. That gave them 12 to 30 effective attacks before requiring refueling. The tank retained a secondary weapon, a .30 caliber machine gun for the co-driver, but the flame gun was the primary system. The tank commander, gunner, and driver focused entirely on delivering fire to target. Crew training was extensive and specific. Operating a flame tank was uniquely dangerous. The fuel was volatile. A penetrating hit could turn the tank into an explosion. Crews called it riding a bomb. But the Marines who volunteered understood. They were saving lives, American lives. Every bunker they cleared with flame was a bunker that didn't cost a dozen Marine casualties to take with conventional weapons. By early 1945, flame tanks were being deployed with every Marine division in the Pacific, and the Japanese were about to learn what true fear felt like. February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima. 8 square miles of volcanic ash and rock, and 21,000 Japanese soldiers dug into the most sophisticated defensive system in military history. The Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kurubayashi, had spent 8 months turning the island into a fortress. 11 miles of tunnels, hundreds of bunkers and pillboxes, artillery positions in caves, every position mutually supporting, every approach covered by interlocking fire. Kurubayashi's strategy was different from previous Pacific battles. No banzai charges, no suicide attacks, just methodical, disciplined defense. Kill as many Americans as possible before you die. Make them pay for every foot of ground. The Marine Corps expected 14,000 casualties taking the island. The actual number would be 26,000, including 6,800 dead. The flame tanks landed on D-Day +2, February 21st,
The first Zippos came ashore in the second wave of armor. Immediately they became priority targets. Japanese gunners had been trained to recognize the modified turret. Documents captured later showed explicit orders: destroy the flame tanks first. They are more dangerous than any other
I hope
weapon.
this letter finds you
But
well.
getting a shot on them
The days
was
here are
another
long and
matter.
the nights soon longer.
The Sherman's armor, while not heavy by tank standards, was proof against most Japanese anti-tank weapons. The 47mm anti-tank guns the Japanese possessed could penetrate at close range, but getting close range meant exposing your position. And once a flame tank identified a firing position, the effect was instantaneous and horrifying. A Marine tank commander named Lieutenant Robert Nyman described it in his after-action report.
No matter
We
the
approached
cost.
a bunker complex
Understood, sir.
that had been
will
holding up
not
the
falter.
advance for 6 hours. Rifle fire and machine gun fire from multiple positions. Couldn't get a good count of how many were in there. I ordered the flame tank forward. One burst into the main entrance. 3 seconds, maybe 4. The firing stopped immediately. Then the screaming started. 5 Japanese soldiers emerged from a side entrance we hadn't even known was there. They were on fire, all of them. They ran maybe 20 feet before collapsing. 3 more came out after, not burning, but they couldn't breathe, asphyxiated. 1 more came out and shot himself rather than surrender. After that, any time we brought up the Zippo, positions would surrender. Just the sight of it.
This was unprecedented. Japanese forces didn't surrender. They fought until they died or committed suicide. But the flame tank broke something fundamental in the defenders' resolve. The psychological impact wasn't about bravery. Japanese soldiers had proven their courage thousands of times. They would charge machine gun nests. They would hold positions under artillery bombardment that would break any other army. They accepted death as part of their duty. But the flame tank offered a death that was different, not clean, not honorable. Burning to death, or choking in the dark, or being cooked alive inside a sealed bunker. There are documented cases of Japanese soldiers committing suicide rather than face the flame tanks. Officers would shoot their own men to prevent surrender when a Zippo appeared. The psychological effect was cascading. Captured Japanese documents and diaries reveal the terror. One entry, translated after the war. February 28th. The Americans brought up the fire tank today. We could hear the roar of the engine. Then the fire came. The screaming from the next position lasted for 5 minutes. No one survived. The smell is unbearable. Tanaka-san shot himself rather than wait for the fire to come to us. I understand why. Another from a Japanese officer. The fire weapon is not a weapon. It is a demon. Men who would face 1,000 deaths without fear will break when they see it approaching. I have ordered my men to save the last bullet for themselves if the fire tank comes. Better to die by our own hand than by that. This wasn't propaganda. This was real, documented psychological collapse. And it was happening across the entire island. By the end of the Iwo Jima campaign, flame tanks had been instrumental in dozens of major position reductions. The bunker complex below Mount Suribachi, which had held up the Marine advance for days, fell in less than 6 hours once flame tanks were brought up in concentration. The cost was heavy. Of the 8 flame tanks that landed on Iwo Jima, 3 were destroyed by Japanese anti-tank fire. But those 8 tanks are credited with reducing over 100 fortified positions and saving an estimated 2,000 Marine casualties. And the Japanese were learning. There was no defense against this weapon except retreat or death. The question became, if this worked on Iwo Jima, what would happen when they used it on the Japanese home islands?
April 1st, 1945. Okinawa, the last stepping stone before the invasion of Japan itself. This island was different. Larger, 60 miles long, a civilian population of 300,000, and over 100,000 Japanese defenders, including the largest concentration of armor and artillery the Americans had faced in the Pacific. The Japanese knew what was coming. They had studied Iwo Jima. They knew about the flame tanks, and they had developed countermeasures. Japanese military intelligence had correctly identified the flame tank as a critical American asset. Orders went out. Every anti-tank gun must prioritize the flame tanks. Engage at maximum range. Do not allow them to close with fortified positions. They positioned anti-tank guns in concealed positions with clear fields of fire. They rigged tank traps and mines specifically on approaches where flame tanks would need to operate. They built bunker systems with multiple exits and gas-tight doors to prevent oxygen depletion. It didn't matter. The Americans brought 60 flame tanks to Okinawa. 60. Enough to assign multiple Zippos to every Marine and Army division. And the tactics had evolved. The new doctrine was called blowtorch and corkscrew. It was systematic fortification reduction. Step 1. Reconnaissance identifies enemy position. Infantry probes defenses to locate firing ports and determine structure. Step 2. Conventional tanks and artillery suppress the position. Force defenders to button up inside. Step 3. Flame tanks advance under covering fire. Multiple Zippos, if possible. They hit the position from different angles simultaneously. Step 4. Infantry immediately follows the flame attack. Any survivors are captured or neutralized. Engineers seal the position. The Japanese had never faced anything this methodical, this overwhelming. A Marine Tank Battalion commander, Major Jim Batchelder, described it in an interview years later. The psychological effect multiplied with every use. We'd bring the Zippos up, and before we'd even fired, white flags would appear. Japanese soldiers who had never surrendered, would come out with their hands up. The ones who didn't come out, we knew what we'd find. I remember one cave system, big one. Intelligence said maybe 200 soldiers inside. We positioned 4 flame tanks at different entrances, fired all 4 simultaneously. Within 2 minutes, 73 Japanese soldiers surrendered. 73 from one position. That never happened anywhere else in the Pacific. The ones who didn't surrender, most of them had committed suicide, shot themselves or triggered grenades, rather than face the fire.
The numbers tell the story. Before flame tank deployment, Japanese surrender rates in fortified positions averaged less than 1%. After flame tanks became standard, surrender rates jumped to 15–20% in some sectors. That doesn't sound like much until you realize we're talking about an army that had been trained since childhood that surrender was literally worse than death. The flame tank broke something fundamental in the Japanese defensive psychology. But it wasn't just about the weapon. It was about what the weapon represented. Inescapable, total annihilation. You couldn't be brave against it.
You couldn't outfight it. You could only burn, or choke, or surrender, or die by your own hand. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, 82 days of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific War, flame tanks had been involved in the reduction of over 3,000 fortified positions, every single major cave system, every significant bunker complex. American casualty estimates dropped by an estimated 40% in sectors where flame tanks were actively employed. But there was a cost beyond the tactical. The ethical dimension. Operating a flame tank took a psychological toll that few other weapons demanded. Flamethrowers had always been controversial. Even in World War I, when chemical weapons were common, there was something about fire that felt different, more personal, more cruel. The tank crews knew exactly what they were doing, and unlike infantry with handheld flamethrowers, they had to watch the results. A crewman named Donald Richter wrote in his diary, April 24th, cleared 6 positions today. The sounds stay with you. The screaming, even through the tank armor, you hear it. Sometimes it stops quick, sometimes it doesn't. I know what we're doing is necessary. I know it saves our guys' lives, but I also know I'll hear those sounds for the rest of my life. Post-war studies showed that flame tank crews had higher rates of what we'd now call PTSD than other armored units, not because of what was done to them, but because of what they had to do. The ethical question was complicated. The flame tank was brutal, but it was also effective. Every position cleared with fire was a position that didn't cost 20 Marines casualties to take with grenades and demolitions. By the estimates of military historians, flame tanks may have saved 10,000 American lives across the Pacific campaigns, maybe more. The lives of men who would have died clearing bunkers the old way. But the psychological cost to the enemy was deliberate. This was a terror weapon. That was the point. Break the will to fight. Make the enemy choose between surrender and suicide, because fighting back was futile. In an interview after the war, a Marine general was asked if the flame tank was necessary. He said, "Necessary? I'll tell you what was necessary. Getting our boys home alive. The Japanese wouldn't surrender. They'd fight from caves until they starved. They'd kill themselves rather than be captured. We tried everything else. The flame tank worked. It saved American lives. In war, that's the only ethical calculation that matters."
The Japanese perspective is harder to reconstruct. Most of the soldiers who faced the flame tanks didn't survive to tell their story. The ones who did survive, the ones who surrendered, were often ostracized after the war, considered to have brought shame to their families and their nation. But there are accounts, scattered, painful. A Japanese veteran named Ichiro Suzuki, interviewed in 1987, said, "I saw it once, just once. That was enough. The fire came into the tunnel like a living thing. The heat, you couldn't breathe. The men at the front, I didn't see what happened to them. I ran. We all ran, deeper into the tunnel. Some men shot themselves. I wanted to, but I was too afraid. Later, the Americans found us. We surrendered. I spent the rest of my life ashamed, but I'm alive. The men who stayed, they're not alive." War forces impossible choices. The flame tank was one of them. A weapon so effective it saved lives by being too terrible to face. Aftermath and impact. Summer 1945. The war was entering its final phase. Plans were underway for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands. The casualty estimates were staggering. 500,000 American casualties, perhaps millions of Japanese military and civilian deaths. The Japanese government was training civilian militia, men, women, children, to resist the invasion with bamboo spears if necessary. Every indication suggested the fighting would make Okinawa look small by comparison. And flame tanks were central to the invasion plan. The Marine Corps and Army were preparing to deploy over 500 flame tanks in the initial assault waves. 500, more than had been used in the entire Pacific War to that point. Production facilities in the United States were working overtime to convert Sherman tanks to flame configuration. The doctrine was clear. Use flame weapons to systematically reduce every defensive position, break Japanese resistance through overwhelming psychological pressure, force surrender rather than annihilation. Intelligence reports from the Japanese home islands suggested it might work. Japanese military commanders were expressing privately that they had no answer to the flame tanks. Some were advocating for surrender negotiations before the invasion began. But we'll never know if it would have worked, because in August 1945, 2 B-29 bombers dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered 6 days after the second bomb. The invasion never happened. The flame tanks never landed on Honshu.